Hello, my name is Jiyoon Park, and this is AP Microeconomics. So the first question on our list is the question of scarcity. Scarcity is a very important topic. It's one of the initial topics in your book. You can find it in unit number 1, which talks about basic economic concepts. So please remember that microeconomics is basically focusing on individual markets, firms, consumers, etc., while macroeconomics looks at the big picture. And that's what question number 1 asks us. Which of the following is not a microeconomic question? Let's look at the options. Option 1 tells us what happens to a firm's revenue if they increase a goods price. So, even if you don't get into the nitty-gritty of the firm itself, this is micro because it focuses on a firm's pricing of a firm and its revenue. So, big highlights to the individual markets. Markets. So you can see that this is a micro after all. The second question answer is, how do labor unions influence wages in the trucking industry? Again, it's a very specific industry, right? The trucking industry. And it is talking about the wages of the labor market. So this is, again, the labor market. And then a specific industry. So it is, again, micro for these reasons. Number C, how does a mother's education influence a child's health? It's not economic if you think about it. So it's about education and health. It is not about economic behavior. You'll see this usually in like a political science or maybe sociology. But overall, it's not related at all. Number D is, how is the unemployment rate related to business cycles? The unemployment rate and business cycles are economic-wide concepts. So unemployment is related to the overall economy. So this is a macro-wide topic. So just put a triangle over here. How should a firm respond if it knows a competing firm will advertise? It's about a firm's strategy and competition. Again, it is about the individual market. So D is your correct answer. Well, I won't go too much into the theory part. There are some things that you should remember. So key terms that indicate macroeconomics. So if you think about macro, it will be terms like national output. It would be unemployment. It would be things like GDP, inflation. So those are all macro. On the other hand, micro is like more firms, consumers, markets. Examples would be like pricing decisions based on competitions, a firm's behavior, consumer choices, etc. So that was a very, very easy, but a very fundamental question that we tackle. Great. Let's move on to the second question. The second question is usually found in your FAQs. We have a good X over here, which is produced and sold in a perfectly competitive market. Excellent. The provided graph shows a market for good X. So some things that you should know from the graph, that the MSC is equal to the MPC. That's the first observation that you need to make. So there is an upward slanting supply curve is the first thing that you should know. The second thing is that there is a marginal social benefit curve. However, it's downward sloping and it is below the marginal private benefit. So please keep that in mind. And of course, any equilibrium is where the MPC and the MPB meet. So, please keep that in mind. But the socially optimal is where the MSC and the MSB meet. So MSB and MSC is where the social market equilibrium meets, and this is the actual equilibrium. Great. So those are some observations. Let's actually move on to the questions itself. Question A is identify the market equilibrium price and quantity. The market equilibrium is basically in a perfectly competitive market, like you have for good X. The equilibrium occurs when the MPC equals to the MPB is equal to the MPB. You have your slides over here. They meet at 15 and 300. So for $15, the 300 quantity for good X would be the correct answer. So $15 and then 300. Please note that and keep that in mind. Great. Let's move on to the second question. You need to calculate the deadweight loss at the market equilibrium, and then you need to show the work. The first thing you need to know is the term, of course, called the social optimal quantity. So what is the socially optimal quantity? It's when the MSC equals to MSB at the efficient point. Excellent. So from the graph, we can see that it is 20 at 200. So quantity 20 at 200 is the social optimal quality that we have. However, the market quantity produces 300. So there is an overproduction due to a negative externality, of course. So the deadweight loss, ultimately, if you think about it, it is the loss of efficiency from the overproduction. So the loss of efficiency from producing 300 instead of 200. So you'll see that there's a triangle forming at the end of the day at quantity 20, 200. So MSB is $20. At quantity 300, let's see over here, it is at $15, right? So the height of the triangle is ultimately $10, very clear. The base of the triangle is 300 minus 200, which is 100 units. And if you apply this formula for deadweight losses at the end of the day, it's 0.5 multiplied by base, multiplied by height, which is 0.5 multiplied by 100 times 10, which is ultimately 500. So the deadweight loss is 500 at the end of the day. Let's move on to number C. Suppose the government wants to eliminate the deadweight loss in the market for good X. Which of the following will achieve the government's objective? A per unit tax on consumers, so this is option A, or a per unit subsidy to consumers. So should it be tax on consumers or subsidy to consumers at the end of the day? In order to achieve the social optimal quantity, we saw that it was at 200 units, right? And there was a negative externality of 300 because firm ignore external costs. So the options that the question is actually giving us is to either reduce demand for the first one, or for the second one, to increase demand, right? Because it's a subsidy at the end of the day, right? And it's not needed at all. So the correct choice would be to per unit tax on consumers. So it will shift the MPB to the MSB and reduce the quantity to 200. So a per unit tax on consumers would be the optimal thing to do. Okay, great. Let's move on to the second part. What is the dollar value of the per unit tax or per unit subsidy identified in part C1? We decided to do a per unit tax on consumers. So the dollar per value is, first off, let's agree that a tax is needed. So difference between MPB and MSB at the socially optimal 200. So Okay, so the second question is, what is the dollar value of the per unit tax or per unit subsidy identified on part C1? We agreed that a tax was needed. So because of the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal private benefits. At quantity 200, the MPB is at a 25 and the MSB is at a 20. So 25 minus 20 equals to $5 per unit. So tax would be ultimately $5 per unit. Okay, let's move on to question number D. Suppose instead the government imposes a price ceiling of $10. Will the price ceiling achieve the socially optimal quantity of good X? Explain. So to internalize the negative externality, so the overconsumption due to divergence between benefits of privates and social benefits, you put a per dollar tax on consumers. And it aligns with the optimal choices that we have, was what we agreed to on the previous answer. So if the price ceiling is at $10, it yields the socially optimal 300, right? At price 10, the quantity demanded is currently at 600. If you look at the marginal social benefits, but firms will only supply where the MPC is at $10 would be from the graph 200, right? So quantity 200, which is below the socially optimal quantity, which is at 300, where they both meet. So the answer is no at the end of the day. The price ceiling causes underproduction and moves the market further to the social optimum, but increase the date rate losses is something that you do need to remember. Okay, great.